Welcome to this special edition of the WAN Manager podcast. So we did our first little season here kind of to replace the hole in our lives left from not being able to have these kinds of conversations at conferences, with a few episodes to try it out. We liked it, so we're going to keep going. We're going to have a season 2 coming out in January of 2021. But before we did that, we wanted to kind of key up season 2 with an end of the year recap. That's always fun. This time of year, everyone's thinking about what happened, and my goodness, 2020 is an interesting year all around to do a sort of recap for. So to do that, I have my right-hand colleague, Elizabeth Thorne, joining me today. Welcome, Lizzie.
Thanks for having me, Greg. It's great to finally be on here. I've been a avid listener of all the podcasts that have come out so far, so I'm really happy to be able to join you for this look back on the year that has been.
That's right, and I never told you that you had to listen, so there you go. So, Lizzie, just real quick, I'm sure a lot of the people listening have met you at a conference or WAN Summit or the like, but just why don't you tell us what you do at TeleGeography?
Yeah, of course. So here at TeleGeography, I'm a research analyst focused on enterprise networks, which has been a newer area of expertise for TeleGeography, something that kind of got carved out when we realized, looking at the wholesale market, that, the enterprise networks was becoming a very interesting and dynamic place to look at. And so that's basically what I do. Previously, I did a lot of work helping to organize the WAN summits, which perhaps some of the people listening to the podcast have attended and met us there.
It's a good place to announce, sorry to interrupt, but that's a good place to sort of officially say we will no longer be involved in the organization and sort of the back office part of the WAN Summit. We're passing that all over to the very capable, wonderful folks at Capacity, but we'll still certainly be participating in an active way. And seeing many of the folks who listen to this podcast certainly have been to a WAN Summit, so we will be there, just not in a quite as active role as TeleGeography has been in the past.
Yes, absolutely. And in addition, I've helped with the WAN Manager Survey, which we'll probably talk a little bit about today in terms of going through some of our preliminary results for that, where we survey and interview WAN managers across various industries about what they're doing with their networks and how they're approaching various topics in network management. And also more things that are, still being developed, but that we'll probably be announcing soon.
Ooh, exciting. That's a great way to sort of, yeah, absolutely. Well done. All right. So Lizzie, to jump right in, I think that if anyone is doing any 2020 recaps, especially in the network world, but really anywhere else, the 800-pound gorilla is going to be distributed or remote work, the impact of the shutdown. So I thought that should be the first place that we talk. And the first thing I wanted to talk about was just the lack of conferences. So since we just mentioned the WAN Summit, how do you think that has sort of impacted doing your research, the WAN Manager Survey you and I work on together, and you do a lot of those interviews and all that? How has that gone this year, given that we have not been able to meet with anyone? We canceled the WAN Summit. New York sort of was supposed to happen right in the first week of outbreak in March.
Yes,
in New York City. So we've had no events this entire year. We haven't been to a WAN Summit since I haven't anyway, since October of last year. London. You went to Singapore.
For me it was Singapore in November. Mm-hmm. It's definitely been a really big change for us, not only just on our enterprise side, but a lot of our business and our research, it comes from talking with people and having conversations, because we really are a pretty small industry when it comes down to, when you think about how many people are out there working in corporate networking, and a lot of the strides we've been able to make in better understanding what's going on in that market and what WAN managers are doing and what they care about comes from being able to bring people together in one place to talk about it. So it was definitely a very unique challenge to deal with. And also we were able to make our first forays into the wonderful world of virtual events.
Yeah, indeed. Which, I mean, has been a steep learning curve for everyone. As I keyed it up is kind of the original impetus behind this podcast, though
Mm-hmm.
I think it's fun, so we'll probably keep going with it after we return to events. But yeah, I think everyone had to sort of throw what they could against the wall and see what stuck. Now we did with capacity have the next gen SD-WAN event that happened mid November.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like we hit a decent stride there with getting people into round table rooms and stuff like that. I learned some stuff anyway, so.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Did you have the same we weren't in the same sessions, so did you have the same experience?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, so backing up a little bit, so we had our Global WAN Week event in August, which definitely was more trying to replicate the feel of a real event in terms of timing and having it over multiple days. And there were actually still a lot of really interesting conversations and topics that came out of that. Especially, we heard some really interesting stuff about next gen SD WAN, which ended up kind of inspiring this event that
Right.
we did recently. But you're right. I think that the way that we scheduled it and arranged everything there, where it was a lot more focused and there was a lot more emphasis put on the roundtables that we did, ended up being a really good conduit to conversations. I ended up being in the room for a really spirited discussion about zero trust networking and remote access
Ah.
solutions, which was definitely informed by everything that's gone on this year and some, kind of decisions of necessity that people needed to make. Um, but I think that that has been a good but not perfect stand-in for the sorts of
Mhm,
in-person
mhm.
conversations that we have. But with things changing so rapidly, everybody having gone through some pretty big shifts in what they had to do, it's more important than ever for us to be having those sorts of conversations. So I thought it ended up being a pretty worthwhile endeavor.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm definitely in the camp that well, we'll talk later about sort of the long-term impact of remote work and whatnot, but I'm in the camp that you cannot replace physical events. There's too many random interactions that happen IRL, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we have sort of landed on some decent proxies to get through to that point, which hopefully there will be events again, maybe end of quarter two next year. We'll see. Fingers crossed. So yeah, so I also wanted to talk, obviously, about the impact of COVID on the WAN itself.
Mm-hmm.
We designed a survey for that shortly after everything happened, but then kept things going throughout the year, and that's interesting in the sense that we got responses to some of this stuff over the period of many months. When we were writing that survey in March or whatever it was, I reckon many of us had no clue. I certainly didn't that we would still be in this situation in December necessarily, right?
Definitely not.
Um, and you did a couple of blog posts, or maybe they're forthcoming. I'm not sure when Jane. Thank you, Jane, for editing this. We'll have this done, but a couple of blog posts on what we found, asking people about the impact of COVID on the WAN. So I thought maybe you could tell us about that. Let's start with just within the folks that responded to our survey over the course of a couple few months in 2020. Were most of them dealing with a lot of remote work? What was kind of the balance there?
Oh, absolutely. So this was a survey that we put out in kind of conjunction with our annual WAN Manager Survey. Uh, when we wrote the WAN Manager Survey, it came out basically right before we realized that this was going to be a very
I mean,
pressing issue. So we
days before. Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
so we quickly created this kind of addendum to it and have been getting a lot of really interesting responses to it, which we're now starting to analyze. So, right, to get started with that, we did hear that the majority of people we surveyed did have their workforces go almost completely remote. 85% of responding companies had the majority of their workforce working remote. And then within that, the most common configuration was having approximately 80% of workers remote with 20% at job sites. And that
Right.
20% could be a lot of different things depending on the industry that that company might be in. If it's more of an industrial company, those might be workers on the factory floor. Or if it's more of a white collar job, perhaps those are people working, in your on-prem data center who need to be able to go in and, actually work with the machines that are there. But
Right.
definitely we saw that this was a pretty across the board shift that many people were dealing with. And it's really interesting, actually, when you consider the fact that, prior to this, even companies that probably could have shifted more of their workforce remote were pretty reticent to. There was a statistic that I found while I was writing that most recent blog post that only only something like 3% of the workforce was full-time remote before the pandemic. Yeah,
Right.
3.6. So that's about 5 million people. So obviously, there has been a pretty massive shift to remote work compared to where we were before all of this.
Yeah, and it's also interesting. I mean, we had a few respondents, as I recall. It's, I mean, pretty small number, maybe 10%. You can correct me, but that were 100% remote.
Mm-hmm.
Even if that doesn't stay, it's important to point out that it is a certain segment of the workers out there. I just read this McKinsey report that I should have pulled up, but I don't. But I think it was something like they expect 1 in 5 workers to be able to do a significant amount of remote work going forward, and that's 3 to 5 days.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to point out that it is still a minority of workers, but that's going to be really variable by vertical or industry or whatever, because if you have, say, an accounting firm or a law firm or something that's almost engineering, say, that's almost entirely knowledge workers, it's going to be very different than something like retail, where only their back office employees have ever been able to work from home, right? So just in thinking about how that looks going forward, I think we're going to see really wildly different problems emerge, or challenges, whatever you want to call it, for different verticals in a way that wasn't there before. You know what I mean? Because before, virtually everyone, you said 3.5%, so like, something like 95+% of people were getting onto the network from a customer site, or from a branch office, or I'm saying as customer from the telegeography perspective, but getting onto the network from a corporate site. And that's going to be very different. 1 in 5 is a big change from 3%, right? So, and that's going to be very different again if it's a knowledge worker company, corporation, versus one that has a smaller portion of knowledge workers. Those with a lot of knowledge workers are maybe going to end up with really very different looking network strategies than they had before.
Oh, absolutely. I think that industry breakdown is going to be really key here, because there is going to be a divide between people who are in the knowledge economy, which is becoming an increasingly large part, at least of the US economy, but also just generally in developed countries, and those who need to go in. And I think it'll be really interesting. One of the topics we have kind of slated for this discussion is, what is the future of the WAN? And I think that's going to be the biggest question, especially for companies where their workers are becoming increasingly unmoored from having to actually go into a physical office site and sit down. It's going to become more a question of how do you connect your employee to their workspace and their work environment, all the tools that they need from anywhere in the world. So that'll be
Absolutely.
that's definitely a thing to keep an eye on.
What were the biggest changes that resulted from the transition, from that sort of you wake up one day and all of a sudden 80% of your workforce is remote when maybe only 3% of them were the day before?
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't easy. We heard from a lot of different people in a lot of different sort of companies. Can you take us through some of the things they told us?
Absolutely. So I kind of like to think about this as a division between short-term impact and then long-term impact. So when we're looking at the short-term impact, definitely the biggest changes, we kind of saw a rapid scramble to just get enough data center bandwidth, because you suddenly have, most of your access to your cloud or other, things that are stored in your servers coming not from your corporate sites, but from various VPNs or other internet gateways from perhaps hundreds or thousands of different users. And so in the immediate days and weeks following forced shutdowns and shift to work from home, more than 50% of survey takers increased their data center bandwidth. And in our interviews, we were kind of able to dig into what that ended up looking like. We heard from people who transitioned 60 to 80% of their workforce in literally one day. Just took their laptops home
That's
and
what
signed it from a
made this so
VPN.
incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That you wouldn't anticipate, necessarily the changes that you needed to make, because just no one ever, even if you were ready. Like many of the folks we talked to said, "Oh, we've had a significant chunk. Maybe it was more like 10 or 20% than that 3% across all industries, but it's still nothing compared to 80 to 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. And even then, it's a lot of it was contingent on how much you had done, what your existing infrastructure already looked at. Some companies we talked to where they had, very, very few remote workers, they were mainly warehouses, people working like that. They literally did not have enough VPN licenses to go around. So,
Right.
in their immediate days, it was like just trying to purchase and spin up enough VPN licenses from their vendor.
Or devices, for that
Yes,
matter.
exactly.
Yeah.
Like literally putting in new devices. We heard from another someone who worked at a financial institution where they went from having, maybe 15,000 people a day who had a VPN license to 80,000. So they ended up having to purchase massive inter-DC bandwidth increases, but they were able to do it really rapidly. And I'll go more in depth of this maybe once we've covered all of these topics. But one thing that really stood out to me was just most people we talked to were able to make these transitions, though it was unexpected and maybe a strain. They were able to keep that business continuity going. People could get connected to the network. They were able to access what they needed to. And I think that's actually speaks to the strength of what had been built beforehand, especially when it comes to, virtualization of things like firewalls and VPN and moving applications to the cloud so that people can actually access them easier than if they had to, get back onto the corporate network and access it in that way.
Yeah. So I've said this many times this year, but it bears repeating that that if this had happened just like 5 years before it did, just as an accident of history, we would have been a lot less ready and able to work, the next day. That moving data off of the corporate premises and having SD-WAN in place with policies that can be pushed around the network, down to even just the ability of local broadband networks to handle this. If you think about what broadband is capable of doing now, the network in a residential neighborhood is used to dealing with people watching Netflix, doing video calls, gaming, all of these things, like all at the same time. So you have to engineer a residential network in many respects a much more robust way than you do maybe like corporate areas, right? Like say an office park, where it's not like in an office park, even if you have corporate users there doing video calls. So it's not the same as having to engineer a network where everyone from the hours of say 8 to 10 or whatever is streaming high definition video. So I think that it's lucky just that we had been in that place and that the carriers had been in that place before all of this hit us at once.
For sure. Though there is the caveat to that the quality of your broadband is highly dependent on your location. We can talk about how
for sure
consumer broadband can be better than the office, but that's parts of the U.S. where they've got high quality fiber running into these areas, or urban locations, parts of Europe and East Asia. But in other areas where WAN managers might be looking at their employees if they're in Latin America, Africa, or even parts of the rural United States, those broadband options might not be so
Mhm.
robust.
Yeah, I recall one interview we did where actually more than one, where they said, "Oh, it's surprising how well our employees' broadband connections work. They have more capacity available." I remember Global Internet made this comment at Global WAN Week. He was like,
Mm-hmm.
"I'm in relatively rural UK and I have 900 megs at my house, which is more than we had in the office." So I mean that is true, but at the same time, of course, you have kids at home doing
Mm-hmm.
online school, partners also working from home, and so there were certainly some bottlenecks there that are vexing for the WAN manager because it's completely beyond their reach, right? So,
I mean,
um,
yeah, that probably compounds the frustration there. It's not the same as when
yeah,
you might have connectivity issues at a site, but you can call up your carrier, get your SLA enforced, and there seems to be some sort of resolution there. In this case, the methods for dealing with any connectivity issues that employees were having were generally more roundabout. Though we did hear people's various strategies. We heard from people who talked about employee education, making sure that their employees understood how to reset their router and deal with their connectivity issues,
hmm hmm
and even encourage them maybe to get their broadband upgraded if they hadn't in a while.
right.
I actually ended up having to do that because
Me
we
too. I
had
did as
major
well. Yeah.
connectivity issues, and then we just upgraded to a 1 gig plan. So now I'm able to actually do things and get on video calls without dropping out.
Yeah, and having as backup, like I have an all you can eat LTE plan,
Mm-hmm.
so I now know how to switch my Wi-Fi to that plan. But we heard one WAN manager mention like you had to educate the employees on like if you were going to use LTE, this is how you do it on your laptop,
Mm-hmm.
or schedule your meetings for these times that aren't peak traffic and that sort of thing.
Right. And so we definitely heard about all those things. But in addition, we also heard about some kind of interesting initiatives that some companies had been taking to more directly improve their employees' broadband plans, which was really interesting.
hmm
We asked about, if people had heard if their company was maybe thinking about paying for, sourcing and paying for their employees' broadband to get like a business broadband connection or an improved one. And a surprising amount of people seem to think that their company would be open to it. We even heard from one person who said that their company was already doing that, which was pretty amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, I was surprised. We threw that question in. I thought everyone would say, "Heck no," But I mean, it makes sense from the standpoint of like if people are business critical and they need to be online, and now all of a sudden a majority or even almost all of them are connecting through these residential connections, the WAN manager can do literally nothing about it
Mm-hmm.
other than try to take them through some of these steps, unless the WAN team is actually the one sourcing that. So I think we may see a change in that direction. It's not going to be every company and in every situation, but I think that may emerge.
No, I mean, it's really interesting actually. I mean, kind of taking a broader view of it, if you have more people who are working from home full time, it kind of brings into the question of, what is a business expense, right? I mean, you already have
Right.
companies
Exactly.
who are, sending their employees home with a laptop, monitor, keyboard, and things like that. But if the company is saving money by not having to pay for the, heating, lighting, power, and internet for an office, those costs are all being those costs are all being, put on the employee. So it's kind of interesting to
Yeah.
see
Absolutely.
if that way of thinking might start to shift.
It's kind of like doing your own checkout at the grocery store, right? It's like I'm laboring for the corporate grocer now, right? So it's there's a sense in which obviously working from home. There's my dog too, all right, but that's all right. Hi, honey bun. There's a sense in which working from home is obviously like preferable from the worker standpoint. But then you're shifting some of your company's costs onto you. You have to buy your own desk, maybe your own external monitor,
Mm-hmm.
pay for your broadband and all that sort of thing. So, but in the case of the broadband, it impacts like I said, the business continuity, and I was really interested to see that some folks think that they're going to move in that direction of sort of taking that over. And that leads me to the next thing I want to talk about, actually, Lizzie, which is I've been working on the market size forecast that we'll have coming out hopefully around the end of Q1 of 2021 or so, and thinking a lot about just literally how many sites there will be in the network model that I created. We heard from folks on this topic. We kind of asked that question in interviews, even if we didn't have an official survey question. So what did they say about office space going forward, and sort of the long-term move toward remote work?
Right. So this is definitely transitioning more into what I would see as these long-term impacts of work from home. I think what we saw from our survey is there has been very little movement so far in terms of turning down either your actual office connectivity. Like, we saw very few people who actually, got out of any of their office connectivity plans, which makes sense because they're in the middle of contracts, and also, no concrete plans, or not as many concrete plans immediately to start reducing office size. However,
right,
yeah, because it's everyone's kind of in a wait and see mode right now. It's not clear when exactly this is all going to clear up, and when that happens, what the plan's going to be in terms of, if everyone's going to be able to work from home full time, or if it'll be sort of a half and half thing. But
right.
we are,
Unless you're like right in the middle of that transition. So like I know we heard from one company who said in one of their cities in the U.S. they were already looking to move that office, and they decided to downsize it, for example, right?
yeah,
Because if you're or other folks who maybe their contract timing wasn't in a place where they're going to get penalties for turning down service, then that's the only place where we saw that. Whereas you're not going to like take penalties in the middle of a 3-year contract just to drop your MPLS port size or something like that.
exactly. I think this is definitely a case where flexibility with work from home is more of a possibility. It's just going to be something that's taken into consideration as companies open new offices. They might look at and decide, everyone in this office can flex work from home, so you don't need as many offices. People can hot desk. Or you're also looking at, okay, like, what roles in this office or in this company can be done from home, and which ones do still need physical locations. So, for example, in financial services, you might want to have your call centers still be in person, but then, or your traders or something like that. But other people can be, your analysts or something like that. They can all work from home, or can be working from home 3 to 5 days a week. And so then you'll apportion for that, and you'll probably need lower bandwidth.
Well, the economists will always say, if you're making a forecast, never give a specific number, or if you do, don't give a specific date. So I did both of those things in our forecast, but I basically had office space in 2021 staying the same. Right? The conventional wisdom is that commercial real estate grows at about 3% a year. I had it flat for next year, a slight decrease the next year, where everyone starts to figure this out. So they're saying, because I think over 2021, it's totally plausible that a lot of people will say, hey, I have this, even if I'm the sort of median corporation, 1 in 5 of my workers can now work from home 3 to 5 days a week. Well, those are often the people who were in the expensive Class A office space too. So I would love it if I had 20 spaces where I had 50 before, and they hot cube or whatever the case may be. So I think that's going to happen. It just depends on sort of what the scale of that is across all the different industries. And then, as you say, there's no doubt that leads to either maybe a shift in service that might push the shift in service, which we'll get to that in a second, I think, or at least a decrease in bandwidth.
Right, absolutely. One last note on this, just from something I saw in the news that I think is kind of interesting. Another interesting kind of wrinkle in this whole real estate, office space question is, once you have, a greater ability for people to work from home or work farther away from the office, you might start to see companies moving away from kind of the urban downtown centers. Like, I saw that Goldman Sachs is considering moving their headquarters from Manhattan down to like Miami, basically.
Right.
because they have more people who'd be able to just work from home. They could move or not move, and by doing that, they could save
Yeah,
$1 billion
Manhattan
in
pricing.
real
Yeah,
estate.
exactly.
There's massive cost
Yeah.
savings to be achieved there if
Mhm.
companies in basically the mid to long term are willing to consider it.
Yeah. So then the last thing that I wanted to hit on the COVID impact explicitly is just in terms of the impact on actually rolling out service. So we've been asking people for many years, especially SD-WAN, obviously, but some other technologies as well, when they were going to have things rolled out. We talked to a lot of folks this year that had intended to have SD-WAN rolled out on a considerable portion of the network, but couldn't achieve that thanks to the shutdown. Do you have any sort of quotes or whatnot on that?
Yeah, we definitely heard across the board that there were a lot of delays in tech rollouts, and they kind of came from both sides. We heard one person who said that they had rollouts planned for March, but actually because of shortages on the vendor side, like they didn't actually have the hardware because if you remember back in March, when China was being basically blocked because it was kind of the
Mm,
epicenter of everything going on, they physically could not get hardware shipped out of the country and gone through customs.
right.
And so they, at the time when we did this interview, it was around March, and so they said they'd probably have to postpone till August, which seemed like a huge burden at the time. But now we're in
Yeah.
December and we're still
Yeah.
here.
Mhm.
So I kind of wonder how that actually ended up going.
Yeah. We'll have to check back in.
Right. So we definitely heard from people who were facing shortages just on the vendor side, which prevented them from getting rollouts done. But then, of course, also on the flip side, because offices were closed and quarantine was in place, you couldn't send technicians in to offices to rip and replace hardware and CPE to actually get these SD-WAN rollouts underway. To put in either your proprietary SD-WAN box or your white box like virtual UVCPE. And so that ended up being a major roadblock for some people. And then also, kind of interestingly, we talked to some people where the whole experience, was making them a little bit question if they wanted to do SD-WAN, because maybe if they were going to go down this path of everyone being remote and, everyone just accessing the network remotely, it kind of leads you to a different configuration of the network.
Yeah, certainly, but I mean, to drive that point home, we there were some. It was a very small number, but there were some folks that we talked to that said they had some kind of SD-WAN device going home with a lot of their remote
Mm.
workers. I think that's going to be really unusual because if you're looking at the cost of having a physical appliance at all of your offices and then all of a sudden that multiplied by the number of employees instead of offices, it would become absolutely prohibitive. Now, of course, there's some software solutions, but even then, it's not like, to my knowledge anyway, somebody can correct me who knows better, but that there are SD-WAN software solutions that you could download onto your like laptop, right? We're talking about things that go on x86 servers and whatnot. So that's a really good point, and it kind of brings me into the next thing that I wanted to hit because as you well know, everybody asks us about this all the time. It's implicated in the thing that I've been spending a lot of my time on, the market sizing report forecast. What is the future of MPLS? And some of this was just well underway, has nothing to do with the pandemic, but I think some of it is maybe accelerated by the pandemic. But just, I don't know, take us through maybe some of the numbers. I don't know how far we are in analyzing the WAN Manager Survey
Mm-hmm.
data. I think a similar number of folks indicated that they had MPLS. I don't know that we have the final numbers on how prominent MPLS is, but
Yes, I'm crunching that right now. I will say that MPLS numbers haven't changed significantly in terms of how
Mhm.
many sites have an MPLS connection. One thing that seems
Right.
to have changed, which is pretty interesting, is that when we did this survey in 2018, most people said that their backups for their MPLS was a passive or active MPLS port. And
Right.
that seems to
Mhm.
have now changed to being
Yeah,
an
good.
alternative like DIA or internet or
Mhm.
LTE as your secondary connection, most likely facilitated using SD-WAN.
That's really gratifying because I've had that scenario in my like pricing presentation for 2 years where I say, here's what it would look like if you got rid of your MPLS backups, right? So it's good to get confirmation that that was a sensible thing to do. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we were definitely hearing, or we're definitely still seeing, there are people who are rolling out SD-WAN who have not yet gotten rid of their MPLS, and are instead, sort of creating that hybrid network where they have DIA or broadband, adding additional bandwidth, and serving the place as a backup in case the MPLS line goes down. And I think we'll continue to see that because it's a good way to get, and you've analyzed this pretty thoroughly through various hypothetical networks, but going with that model is a good way to get a lot more bandwidth for about the same price or less. So that's definitely something.
yeah, exactly. Again, it was fun to see some of these quotes from our interviews, and you did some of the interviews without me, so I hadn't really seen them until I reviewed it
Mm-hmm.
for this. But that you had some folks saying, yeah, we cut our MPLS connections down, but we kept them. Others who said, we went with a combination for now, but if the let's say we have a triple combination, MPLS, DIA, broadband. If we see the DIA and broadband with the SD-WAN are doing okay, we'll eventually drop the MPLS, but we just couldn't do it until we proved that out. Again, these are all sort of things that we had run through as possible SD-WAN enabled scenarios before. So it was really cool to hear folks say that they were going to do that. Now, of course, COVID impacts all of this. And when you're having everyone do what they need to do through SaaS, if you have a security posture like something like Zscaler, where you don't need physical appliances at your work site, I think that that's going to accelerate people leaving MPLS behind.
I mean, it's got a sting to be paying, an exorbitant amount of money, like 10K for MPLS connections to a site that no one's sitting at.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, even in cheaper markets where your MPLS is only maybe a few hundred or a few thousand, it still adds up when you have hundreds of sites around the world. I think that when in certain verticals they see that things are working the same, that over the past year there's going to be a lot of analysis of what happened in 2020, right? And especially those who have monitoring tools, and that again, those monitoring tools are going to end where they're getting onto the network in many cases or whatever. But I think when you look at how applications performed and productivity levels just from that standpoint, and see what that impact was, I'm just assuming here that it's going to be that people kept being productive and still were able to do what they do. But I think that's what we've by and large heard from everybody. I think there's going to be a long, hard look at even to some extent DIA, maybe, compared to broadband, because all of us at home, more or less, I don't know anyone that I can think of that has a DIA connection at home. It's unusual to find that offering in a residential area. Maybe some people live downtown can, but you're looking at consumer grade broadband. Maybe some people have business grade broadband, but that's a difference of contract more than functionality. It's still contended, that sort of thing. And if people are getting things done, I think a lot of WAN managers are going to take a hard look at that and say, hey, why am I paying tens of millions of dollars for this when I could be paying a lot less, certainly. So
exactly. Yeah. And definitely one of those things where there's already been a kind of declining curve, but this will just accelerate it, I think.
I just jumped into this, but maybe we could talk more about the do you even need a WAN question. I was giving my opinion there, but we've asked people this question more or less, and I'm curious to get your sort of rendition of what they said in those interviews.
Well, it's funny because it's kind of a question that's still being asked in hushed tones right now.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Just a little.
to be fair to ourselves, we are WAN analysts, right? So it's not like we want there to not be a WAN, although there's certainly lots of things to talk about. There is always going to be a WAN for some verticals. I think we reminded ourselves to keep it there, but also that maybe more a change in definitions of what they're still going to be WAN and IT infrastructure managers, but they might be dealing with a very different kind of set of problems, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's just going to be yet another evolution in what the corporate network looks like for some companies. It's gone from being literally like private lines that you procure from the carrier that connect all of your networks in like a kind of hub and
Right.
spoke model, to then we had MPLS, which was this more mesh, and then SD-WAN, which is probably going to be the ideal model for a lot of people, even moving forward, where you've got various connections still connecting your corporate sites and like tying in those remote users. But and the thing that's been really interesting and has kind of been illuminated by the COVID shutdowns is that there are some companies, especially ones that are much more based in the internet, software companies or tech companies,
Mhm.
where all of their resources are being held in the cloud, or they don't really have a lot of on-premises architecture that they need people connecting to, and they don't have either retail-ish or factory sites where they
Right.
need people there, or they need to they have like business critical applications that need 2 or 3 MPLS lines to keep up at all times, where there's a really interesting proposition here where you could just have all of your users connecting through the internet, being sorted through some sort of remote access solution such as Zscaler, and being authenticated to access SaaS or infrastructure as a service
Mhm.
applications in the cloud. So this is something that we're kind of hearing people who are, perhaps in some of these more like agile internet companies are starting to think about. But I think one thing that's kind of interesting about it is that this is already a reality for many small businesses, including,
Mhm.
ours, TeleGeography. We use cloud, basically cloud and internet for everything. But with,
Yeah, we've essentially never had a WAN,
yeah,
right? So,
like it's
yeah,
been the
yeah.
reality for a lot of small companies that they just don't
Mhm.
have a WAN. They just put everything in the cloud or on internet. But
Right.
with sort of zero trust security models and remote access solutions, and this sort of like the improved internet that a lot of people have at their home office or at their homes, this is a possibility that could expand to some mid-sized enterprises.
Mhm.
It remains to be seen if this is actually something that could be viable for a true global enterprise. Because I think
Yeah,
for me, the
but
question that's still not
honest
answered in this is, what do
Mhm.
you do about your global backbone?
Sure. Yeah, yeah, for sure. But I mean, on its face, it's certainly plausible. So, like in the episode we had this season with Lionel Marie from Schneider Electric, and he outlined sort of the 4 pillars of zero trust. I know we're skipping security more or less, but just to throw that in there, that if who all of your what all of your devices that are connecting are, all of your users, what applications each of those users can have access to, and you treat every network as a potentially hostile entity, then that really works just on the internet. Right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's nothing there, and furthermore, having a, as they call it, software defined perimeter, where you don't have to have a physical perimeter, the sort of moat and castle model, or the demilitarized zone of firewalls inside the data center. I mean, that there, everything about that, which again was underway before this happened, but everything about that was really primed to just allow everyone to do what they need to do on the internet, along with SaaS and that kind of thing. So I think there's a plausible argument to be made there. You're right that then there's the matter of like maybe bandwidth between data centers, which we've asked about that. We're still analyzing the WAN Manager Survey data, so we'll give you a better answer later. But I mean, there is that out there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we had some folks say, yeah, we do have private lines in our WAN, whereas before, I think most enterprises really were relying almost entirely on MPLS, even to, like, say, connect to the data center, connect to the cloud operators, that sort of thing. But that's, I think the big but is that it's just like you say, that it's for companies where most of what they're doing on the WAN now is these SaaS applications and that sort of thing. There are other folks that we talk to that still have on premises data centers, for example,
Mm-hmm.
right? That still going to have some of their own homegrown applications and things like that. I wonder if maybe we should think of it from some of our top industries that we have in our survey. So we get a lot of folks from business services. It strikes me business services in the Global 5000 is a pretty broad category, but it strikes me that the stuff that you just said and I added on to really falls under for them pretty easily, right?
Yeah,
So business
like an
services
accounting firm
tends
or
to be
something. You don't need people to be
exact.
in an office for that
Yeah,
necessarily.
there's staffing agencies, whatever the case may be, or tech support. Like we get responses certainly from the folks that are offering, IT outsourcing, all those kinds of things. But as I move down, our next biggest vertical is in industrials. Well, that's a pretty obvious use case where IoT devices are at a physical location, along with workers at those places interacting with the network, or maybe even firms that have to do collaborative engineering between. Maybe the engineers can be at home, uh, but they have to have access into the IoT or other devices at the factory that just really need to be on an intranet in order to do that. Even if the engineers say VPNing in, you're not going to be able to just treat that the same way that we treat UCC tools, or other SaaS kind of applications that in certain verticals are really all they need. We also have retailers and wholesalers on there, and that's an obvious one in our sort of top 5 verticals that we have in our survey. It's hard to see retailers and wholesalers getting rid of the WAN ever, right? So
Yeah. Though it is interesting. I think that it definitely depends on industry. It depends on the kind of format of the business itself. Because I think that one thing I'm really interested in looking at going forward, and this is not necessarily a type of company that would be able to totally get rid of their WAN, but definitely very much reduce it, is the sort of a company that's more franchise based. So
mm,
where each franchisee kind of sources their own broadband, for example, and then maybe
right.
they
So they've
connect
already
that
been
just to
doing
like one
that, right?
HQ.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's an interesting
Hmm.
case where a lot of these same tools can be used to drastically reduce the cost of the WAN and follow a lot of those same principles. And maybe you have a very, very reduced corporate WAN that's just for your, few corporate headquarters, and for them to connect to the data center and perhaps send some data to the franchisees. But for the most part, the franchisees could just be on the internet, access things through SaaS and through these same principles of zero trust that we're talking about. So I don't think it's necessarily just restricted to, as we were talking about, these companies where it's business services or companies where they don't have anything on the ground. In terms of the full kind of structure of these WANs, I think there's still a lot of really interesting possibilities there.
Yeah, and it made me think back on sort of what I just said to you, and the retailers and wholesalers, for example. Retail might actually be a pretty good use case of saying, "Hey, like, what do we need to do at a point of sale kind of place?" It's like just process inventory at a centralized database that's in the cloud now through a cloud provider, even, right? And do credit card processing, which is outsourced anyway, right? And totally able to be done over IPsec. So yeah, is definitely the possibility for a lot of disruption. I think maybe more so than even some folks in the industry have been thinking about. And that makes me wonder if the message for everybody on the vendor side listening to this isn't think through really robust internet options, right? Because everyone's going to be able to source that's what they're thinking about now, is sourcing internet. How well does my traffic perform just on the basic internet, and what's the difference between using just local ISP versus tier one internet provider that has a really broad reach, and how does that affect whether I'm willing to kind of leave behind all of the WAN technologies altogether? And of course, we're thinking of this, through the lens of still having SD-WAN, which is still a WAN, where there's kind of the possibility of the more radical step of not even having SD-WAN. I think that's going to be really limited or bleeding edge, at least for quite some time.
Though that's an interesting case. I still think that there is a place for SD-WAN even in these sort of more radical models, because if you still want that kind of load balancing, the load balancing, right, and application optimization, all of that sort of thing, I think that can still have a place there. It's just really interesting to think about it when it's been separated from the install at each corporate site model that we traditionally think about.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a lot of fun, Lizzie. I'm fascinated that we only got through like sort of half of the topics that I had outlined.
Who could have foreseen this?
There's a lot to talk about.
I mean, who doesn't love just listening to analysts talk to each other?
I must confess that I'm a religious listener to like the 538 podcast, for example. So we were a bunch of analysts talking about what they saw in the data that week. So there's some of us out there anyway, dozens of us.
As long as the vibes are good. Hopefully we have good vibes.
Oh, of course we do. Come on. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lizzie. And I'm sure that you'll be back, even if as an analyst role in season 2, since we have some new stuff coming out. And at the very least, I know you'll come on to talk about the WAN Manager Survey once we're done learning how to analyze all those data in Python.
I will bend
transitioning from Excel to Python, and it's
bend
painful.
Python to my will if it kills me.
Me too. Although I think as a young person with a still fully functional brain and no children, you're going faster than me, but I'll get there.
My 2 brain cells, they're rubbing together. Something's happening.
Yes. Beautiful. Awesome. Well, thanks, Lizzie, and happy end of 2020 to everybody out there.
Yes. Happy end of 2020.
Thanks very much for listening. The WAN Manager podcast is brought to you by TeleGeography, a division of Primetrica Incorporated, and is edited and produced by Jane Miller. I wrote the theme song you're listening to right now, and we get administrative canine support from my dog Honeybun, who you might hear chiming in from time to time when the mood strikes her. If you want to learn more about our data, head over to telegeography.com, where you can find our blog that covers many of the topics we hit here, and you can sign up for our WAN Manager newsletter. Until next time, have a great day.